Hey everybody, it's Albert, and I'm going to discuss today Psalm 12:7 and the whole "Thou shalt preserve them" versus him versus us controversy. I know I've discussed this in the past, and many other people have discussed it, but I wanted to bring up one additional point. That's actually the opinions of the King James translators themselves, which often sort of get lost among King James Onlyists in all their odd theories. When you get to that verse, and for those who aren't familiar with the controversy, Psalm 12, and the King James Onlyists will concentrate on verses 6 and 7. Where he speaks of God's words being refined 7 times, and then in verse 7 thou shalt keep them, O Lord, thou shalt preserve them, and they interpret the thems as referring to the words. But if you read the entire psalm in context, it's a common theme in the Psalms that God's people are subject to the mechanizations of evildoers, and it speaks of all of this, and then says that God promises that He will cut off the wicked and lead the righteous to safety, lead His people to safety, and it's. At that point, it then states that God's words at this point are purified 7 times, etc., indicating basically perfect. They are perfect and pure. What's being preserved in this is not actually the words; it's God's people. That the fact that God will keep His word, that His word is pure, means that He will in fact preserve His people as He had promised. So in context, rather than just taking the 2 verses out of context, if you look at the whole context, it's obviously speaking of God's people. Now, more importantly, though, is you actually look at the Hebrew in here. And ancienthebreworg does a wonderful job of explaining the Hebrew on the "thou shalt preserve them" in the KJV, that it's not actually them at all. The form for what's being preserved, the pronoun here is actually it can be in and of itself can be interpreted one of 2 ways. One is as first person plural, which would be us, and the other is as third person singular in the energetic, because of the energetic noon. Now there's a different form for the standard third person singular, which would be "thou shalt preserve him." The energetic noon emphasizes the him, so rather than "thou shalt preserve him," it would be "thou shalt preserve him," with the emphasis. And so that's what he sort of accepts as the, and I think he's right on that it's the energetic noon with the emphasis on the him. And if you look, but what's interesting there is that you will then have King James Onlyists, that's what you say. Well, I mean, don't you? King James scholars were all these brilliant guys, and they knew Hebrew. They wouldn't have made a basic mistake like this. Well, the fact is, they really did know it, and they put it in for an entirely different reason. And that's what King James Onlyists don't realize. And I wanted to bring this up because Jeff at ancienthebreworg may not actually realize this himself, and because his whole emphasis has always been on the Hebrew, not on the history of the King James Bible. But it's interesting that one thing that you'll find in the King James Bible, or won't find in the King James Bible, in most printed editions, are the King James translators' margin notes, which were in the original but aren't in most of the current printings. There is, in fact, a margin note for Psalm 12:7, and it states that the Hebrew is him, signifying every one of them. So basically, what's happened here is they're fully aware the Hebrew is him, and they're saying the him here is an idealized one of God's people. Basically, the him is a stand-in for every one of God's people, every one of them. And what they've done is actually made it them to parallel the "thou shalt keep them, O Lord, thou shalt preserve them," to keep the poetic form. Because one of the things that King James translators emphasized a great deal was the literary style, and obviously the them and him could be a little confusing, but them and I mean it obviously has a far better poetic form as having the same thing signify the same thing, and that's what the reason it reads them. It has nothing to do with the underlying Hebrew. But the fact that they know it's him, and they're saying that him signifies every one of them, so they put the them in as this instead because the literary form means that they understood it to be one of God's people and not the words. So now I ask the King James Onlyists, well, these King James translators were brilliant men. Why don't you're always telling us that oh, well, they knew everything. Well, here in their own margin notes, they're stating it's really God's people, not the words, and yet you insist that they're wrong, even though it's their translation, and they give the reason why they translate it that way, and yet you ignore it. I think it's interesting. But as I've stated before, it's just basically an a priori. King James Onlyism is built on a priori assumptions and not evidence, and there you have another example. Thank you very much for your time.